These are the generations of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after he fathered Arpachshad 500 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Arpachshad had lived 35 years, he fathered Shelah. And Arpachshad lived after he fathered Shelah 403 years, and had the other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he fathered Eber. And Shelah lived after he fathered Eber 403 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Eber had lived 34 years, he fathered Peleg. And Eber lived after he fathered Peleg 430 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he fathered Reuben.
And Peleg lived after he fathered Reuben 209 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Reuben had lived 32 years, he fathered Sarah. And Reuben lived after he fathered Sarah 207 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Sarah had lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor. And Sarah lived after he fathered Nahor 200 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he fathered Terah.
And Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren; she had no child. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran.
Okay, thank you. So we have here the plan of God being culminated here in the spreading of the nations. What we've seen so far, Susanna, just a quick overview of where we've been in Genesis, is God had the plan. He established a garden, beautiful, lush, verdant, green, and he set the man in the garden. And man was not content. He rebelled. He rebelled against the one command of God that God had given. And so he was banished from the garden. And then we have the rest of redemptive history. So we have the establishment of, in Genesis 3:15, God's promise that he would provide a redeemer, and then that being carried on. And yet, because of the sin of Adam, because he is the federal head, because his sin gets transmitted by ordinary generation to all of the future generations that come, then what we have is that sin nature being given to every man, woman, child. Everyone is conceived in sin, as the psalmist admits and confesses. So you have then the increase of wickedness and violence throughout the initial propagating of the human race outside of the Garden of Eden. So much so that God says, I will have to destroy. The judgment has to come on the face of the earth because of the increase of sin and because of that violence. And so then God is going to send a flood. Why did he send a flood? Directly because of the justice of God and the demand, the outcry, because of the violence of the people on the earth. Therefore, he has to send that judgment forth. And yet Noah was a man of righteousness. He found favor in the eyes of the Lord. God redeemed his people. There was as God is seeing this, and it's nothing is going to take God off guard. And yet, if you can look and see that the godly line that's established through Seth is being overtaken, and so then there's he has to preserve that. that line. He does it through Noah, through Noah's sons, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. And they're saved in the flood. All of humanity is destroyed because of their sin, and then we start over again. And it isn't 100 years, and then all of a sudden, man organizes against God, Nimrod probably being that individual that is organizing all of the humanity, or a good chunk of humanity against God, and forming the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel being a shake your fist at God, be independent of God, and so then God in judgment, but God in mercy also comes down, gives the languages, and that forms the basis for the dispersal that we now have. God's plan is that the people will go out, that they will fill the earth and they will subdue it. That command was given to Adam. It was also given to Noah. They didn't want to do it. They wanted to hang out and organize against God. God changes their language. Now they have to disperse. And so we see from the Table of Nations in chapter 10, now we see that great dispersion that we talked about last week ends up being solved. The language difficulty ends up being solved actually in Christ, in the outpouring, in Acts, where you have the evangelists going out and ministering to the people in their own language, being empowered by God to overcome that barrier of language. We said that with the language goes the culture, so you have various people groups that end up spreading throughout the world. The Japhethites go up into Europe. You have the Ham and the Canaanites going down into the present day Jerusalem and that area, Canaan, and to the east you have the Shem, and so those Shem and Ham are overlapped, and so then where we find ourselves then is into the great genealogy that we have here. Now, there's a couple of questions that I'm going to throw out to the audience here and ask the question of what do you see when you look through all of these numbers in Genesis 11, 10 through 32? What is it that you notice? What are some thoughts? This is just open-ended. Actually, it's not open-ended. We'll get to my point here in a minute.
Well, for one, it's not a historic start here and end here, in the sense that everything is covered. Because otherwise, certain people would be the same age as Abraham, so there's certain points of emphasis. It's not necessarily meant to be read as in like every single year is accounted for particularly.
Okay, that's not my point, but you can. We'll take that.
It seems like they all had kids in their 30s, except for Tara. He waited till he was 70.
Okay.
That's not. That's what we voted.
That's what we
When you open it in the question, you got to be.
Oh yeah, you got.
What was?
That's what
Like
we
I said.
And they all live a really long time.
Okay. How long?
Like 500 years. Then somebody lived over here 200 years. Oh no, lived 200 years and had other sons and daughters.
Yeah, you
So
got to do
long,
some math here.
Yeah.
150 something years.
But let's talk about the trend.
They're getting shorter and
They're
shorter.
getting shorter and shorter. Okay, so Noah, Noah lived to be 950 years. You do all the math, and Shem then lived to be 600 years. Noah came off of the ark. What's the deal? How come he didn't just die? Well, there's this genetic, overtaking, and the second law of thermodynamics, or entropy, or let's say sin, ends up taking effect. Now you've got that shield that removes the radiation, doesn't allows that to come in and in more force, and you have Shem living to 600. you've got Arphaxad living to 438, Selah 433, Eber 464, and then it's going to go, it's going to drastically diminish from there. I think Abraham was 175, something like that. So what you see is this life expectancy. Then before the flood, these guys are living 900. Methuselah lived, I think, what was it, 972, says 69, okay. And he's the oldest dude, but hey, Noah, even after the flood, still lives to be 950 years, presumably because of his righteousness and that effect on his life. You would anticipate that people that live righteously, unless they're beheaded, end up living to be older. And you have that aging process that kicks in. Okay, it's Shem has Arphaxad about 2 years after the flood. It's about 100 years after the flood, that 101 years, Morris calculated, that we have the incident of the Tower of Babel. So it didn't take all that long. Before that, if you do all of the begats and all the begats, then probably the flood, at least according to Usher's calendar, was somewhere around the 1600 and 1700 after the beginning of time that the flood comes in. I may be getting those numbers wrong. If you're looking at me swirly, but whenever Noah gets a critical look on our face, then I'm doing the back shuffle here. But whereas if I look over it, no, I won't.
I'm looking.
You're not safe either direction, really.
Exactly. Okay. The line goes through, and I will just repeat. I mentioned Calvin's comment about all of the begats here. And what Pete mentioned last week, or the last time that we were together 2 weeks ago, was that this is to a specific audience, that this Moses is writing to the people that are coming out of exile, and they're going, the natural question, who are we? Where did we come from? How about these Egyptians? How about all of these people that are arrayed against us? What's the deal? Where did they come from? And he answers that question. He answers for us where this ends up in Jesus Christ, the line of redemption. And so we have all of the begats to be able to get to Jesus Christ and his coming to earth. But what Matthew Henry said was, it's almost like the Holy Spirit goes speeding through all of the genealogy here to get to the point of Abraham, or Abram, as his name is originally. So that now he can tell the key story. It's like, you're rushing because you want to get to the good part of the story. That's, what Matthew Henry was saying about the Spirit's discussion of what's going on there. And yet, still presenting that genealogy. And so, is that fast enough so that I don't bore my audience?
What's the verse that says God says, I will no longer contend with man, X, and he talks about where's that?
Genesis 6.
Is that 6?
Like first couple of verses.
Yeah, my spirit will no longer contend with men.
Yeah, no, so that's what I was saying. Your question about the genealogy, that's an actual outworking of that statement of fact by God.
And
but it's a gradual, again, just like you shall surely die. It wasn't instantaneous. It was a graceful progression of.
Yes, another good point. Good point. I didn't mention that. That's an excellent point. Okay, so we have a parallel here between Terah and Noah. Both have 3 sons. Those sons are named. We give the ages of the names, but they are not similar in some other ways. So Amanda, can you get Joshua 24, verses 2 and 3? And Ben, can you get Genesis 24:10 Lydia, can you get Genesis 28:10? So these are the other mentionings of, you know, what's going on here. Shem and Noah are preachers of righteousness, examples, good examples, and yet we can see that the example of one person doesn't overpower the sin of many. And the fact that these people were organized against God, that even God says that if they are organized against me, then nothing that they plan will be withheld from them, that they will be able to organize themselves against God and then destroy humanity. So God doesn't allow for that. And yet, in the history of redemption, we have various people that turn away. So we have, first off, talking about Terah and Genesis 24, Terah and Nahor, 24, 2 and 3.
I thought it was Joshua.
Joshua,
Okay.
24, 2 and 3. Yeah.
Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago your forefathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the river and led him through Canaan and gave him many descendants. I gave him Isaac."
Okay, back to the big map. Okay, show and tell. See, class? Okay, where's Ur? Anyone?
Right there.
Right there. Okay, so the Fertile Crescent. Down here is the town of Ur. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to Canaan. Where's Canaan? Canaan is kind of modern day Gaza, if you will. Ashdod, what's the other town? Ashkelon. Those towns are where, Canaan covers a geographic area. But you can see that, hey, the straightest distance between 2 points is a straight line, right? I mean, the shortest distance. We can go straight across there, but what's in between? We got sand dunes and desert and scorpions and all of that stuff. So we're going to avoid the Arabian desert. We're going to go by the Fertile Crescent because that's going to have, hotels. It's going to have food. It's going to have the stuff that we need to go to. And we're going to go up to Haran. So we're going to go, presumably there's some sort of divine guidance because he knows that he needs to go over here to Canaan. But it seems like from the text that they end up getting stopped in Haran, and here's Haran. You see that Fertile Crescent, and you see kind of the top of where the river would be, and that's where they end up going, and they kind of stop there. What's the deal? I mean, you could speculate. You could say he likes being in a city. He likes, being in an established community. It could also be very likely that Terah is too old to move any further, and so then they're not able to continue the trip. So, I mean, speculations abound, but that's where we're at in terms of the text. And Terah, even though in the godly line, ends up serving other gods. That's what Joshua tells us about. So that's where the comparison between Noah and Terah end up stopping, that Noah was a man of righteousness. In spite of his sin, in spite of getting drunk, he still is, a preacher of righteousness through his life. And but Terah not so much. Practicing idolatry, as our text tells us about. Nahor and Haran end up establishing cities elsewhere. Other than where there's supposed to be Genesis 24:10.
Genesis 24:10. All right. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and left, taking with him all kinds of good things from his master. He set out for Aram Naharaim and made his way to the town of Nahor.
Okay, and 28:10.
Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran.
Okay, meaning that it's not in where Beersheba is, and there's, the other towns were established. So they're not in, obviously where they're supposed to be or where they're intended to go in some capacity. And we're going to pick that up in the next chapter when we get to what Abram is told. Is Abram the oldest son, or is he the most important son? We saw this pattern before, that Shem was probably not the oldest. He was just the most important in terms of the history of redemption. And so that's why he ends up being listed Shem, Ham, Japheth. We see a similar pattern here. Let's do the math. We go to the end. How old was it that Terah was when he died? Go to verse 32. 205 years. If you do that math, you find out that, let's see if I can go through the text. Noah, can you get Acts 7:4? Very appropriate. Preaching through. And Kim, can you get Genesis 20, verse 12? Okay, we're trying to do the math, trying to figure out, how does this work out if it's exactly the way that this is listed, the math won't work out properly. So there's a key point that comes out of this. So we'll continue with the math. Acts 7:4 says,
Then he went out from the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran. And after his father died, God removed him from there into his land in which you are now living.
Okay, so it's after he dies. So then Terah dies in Haran, and he's got that extra 75 years of his life to account for. Therefore, Abram is not the one that is born to Terah at the 70th year. Verse 26, Terah had lived 70 years. He fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran, probably the other way around, and at least Abram ends up being born, according to this math, about at 130 of Terah's life. So we see that order, what that order gives us is that he's making a special point about Abram, that Abram is that important line through whom the history of redemption is going to continue. So, and yet, what happens with Abram? Abram gets married. He gets married to Sarai, and Sarai, who's Sarai? And Genesis 20:12 tells us.
Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife.
Okay, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of his mother, kind of the half-sister kind of thing. So that means that she is born to Terah, and yet, there's some speculation that maybe she was Iscah. The verses 29 and 30 kind of flow together in there, but you can't really make that determination. But at least that's the relation. And the reason that Moses is putting in Sarai and Milcah is because these ladies are important to the narrative, and to the people that come from them obviously are going to be, at least for Sarah, the keeping of that line that leads to Christ. Sarai is barren. She has no children. If Abram is going to be the one through whom we're going to continue this line, then obviously we have to have kids. And even though Abram is the guy that's the righteous one, and he's going to keep this line going, he's going to be vexed in his conscience because he can't have any kids. And is there understanding at this point in Abram's life? We don't know. We know that from Hebrews 11 that he is the father of the faithful, that the most turf in the faith chapter is devoted to Abraham, and so he's a man of faith, and he would have lived out that faith as well. So we're going to see that demonstrated as we go into chapter 12. But for now, he's childless, and he looks around and goes, "This isn't fair. I'm not having any kids. I'm doing the righteous thing. You know, what's the deal?" We continue to live by faith. We walk with, by the eyes of faith, not by what we see. And it isn't necessarily in this life that we get our reward. It is, in the life to come that the benefits of faith have their full implications, although we can anticipate that things are going to be better for us in this life living by faith. So that's a statement there. And any comments so far? Voss said that in the history of redemption, that his biblical theology talks about how does God reveal himself to the people of God. So far what we have is God declaring himself in a name, that name in the Hebrew is El, and I'm just going to quote what Voss said, that El ends up transitioning into Elohim. And what is the meaning of God, El, that goes into Elohim, the mighty one, that you would understand about God in a name is the concept, and that presents us information. So in the history of redemption, we've already been given some information about how God is working in history, Genesis 3:15, and also through Noah, the command to go into the world to multiply and to fill the earth and subdue it, and the dominion mandate. We have that information. We also have the name of God being revealed to the people of God, that they would know about God because of his name, because his name conveys some of the character of God, that God is the mighty one, in spite of what we see, in spite of this great flood that has come on the earth, in spite of the fact that we've had the dispersion because of sin, that God is in control and God is a mighty God. We would still have that information available to us as we go through the history of redemption, even though we may not have more information like we would like. We would like to look back and say they had more information. They did, in terms of how that's been conveyed from person to person. We have a lot of the history of redemption being given from Adam to his offspring, to Seth, and then making it to Noah. Noah carrying that information from the ark and then giving it to his offspring as well, and making it down here to, he would have some, Abram would have some access to the information, to the history that hasn't passed into legend yet, but he would not necessarily know that fully because of man's sin. We see that man is practicing idolatry. That idolatry is going to lead astray. We have the Egyptian gods, we have the Sumerian gods being mirrored in the Greek gods and the Roman gods. So you have a pantheon of gods. We even have over in India that same sort of, in Hinduism, that same sort of pantheon of gods, multiple gods. That being a pull away from the true worship of the triune God, of the mighty God. And so then, even though that is watered down, there is still God revealing himself to his people through his name. Sorry. Multiple thoughts in there. Okay, any thoughts on that? Any comments? Another thought that Voss had was that in the unity of the people as they united at the Tower of Babel against God, that in that unity and then into the dispersion, what you have is that worship of false gods or the false god, self, and then that being dispersed. In other words, God's saying that it's better for the people here to worship multiple false gods rather than to unite and worship one false god. So then that's one control. Pete mentioned the control that God is placing on sin, that life expectancy and that spiral downward, the decreased lifespan, but also the fact that they would be worshiping false gods, but they would be worshiping false gods that are not like those other false gods, even though in concept they're all false gods. You can't argue with the genealogy, can you? Okay, well, cool. We'll get a chance to talk more. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for your word. And we thank you, Lord, for giving us the history that you have recorded for us, Lord, that you have preserved this in your word. Against all of the attacks of the enemy, Father, you have given us a true word and a true knowledge of how you operate in history. Father, thank you that we have your word, and help us to be obedient to it. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.